My father always told me that the world moved on the back of paperwork and shipping containers. We lived in a quiet cul-de-sac where the loudest sound was the morning sprinklers. He ran a logistics company from a nondescript warehouse near the docks. I never questioned why he took phone calls in the middle of the night in a language I didn't recognize. It started when a stray envelope arrived at our house instead of his office. The return address was a port in Montenegro that didn't exist on any map I could find. I felt a cold shiver when I noticed the envelope was sealed with heavy industrial wax. That night I waited until my parents were asleep to find a spare set of keys. The keys were hidden inside a hollowed-out book in the library. I drove to the warehouse under the cover of a sudden torrential rainstorm. The gates of Vance Global creaked open with a sound that felt like a warning. The air inside smelled of ozone, old paper, and something metallic like dried blood. I walked past rows of shipping crates that were labeled as medical supplies. But when I brushed against one, I realized it was reinforced with plates of lead. I reached my father's inner office and fumbled with the lock. Inside, the desk was cleared of everything except for a single leather-bound ledger. The names in the ledger weren't clients, they were political figures from across the globe. Beside each name was a specific weight and a delivery coordinate in the middle of the ocean. I heard the sound of a car engine idling outside the warehouse entrance. 2 sets of headlights swept across the office walls like searchlights. I dove under the desk just as the heavy warehouse doors began to grind open again. Voices echoed through the vast space, speaking in the same guttural tongue I'd heard from my father's office. One voice was unmistakable. It was the calm, melodic tone of my father. He wasn't talking about logistics, he was talking about disposal and total erasure. He mentioned my name, saying I was getting too curious for my own good. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I feared they would hear it. I waited for them to move toward the back loading docks before I crawled out. A hidden panel in the wall was slightly ajar, revealing a staircase leading down. I descended into a basement that wasn't on any building blueprint. The room was filled with industrial-sized vats of acid and rows of plastic-wrapped furniture. On a stainless steel table sat a collection of passports, all with different names but my father's face. My father wasn't a businessman, he was a ghost, a fixer for the world's most dangerous men. I heard the heavy thud of footsteps descending the stairs behind me. I looked for another exit, my eyes darting around the sterile, windowless room. The door was locked from the outside, trapping me in the belly of his secret empire. My father's voice rang out from the top of the stairs, devoid of any fatherly warmth. "I told you shipping was about more than just boxes, son," he whispered. He stepped into the light, and I didn't recognize the man standing before me. I realized then that my entire life had been a carefully curated lie. Just as he raised the weapon, a thunderous explosion rocked the warehouse above us. The lights cut out, plunging us into a terrifying, total darkness. In the silence that followed, I heard a new voice, cold and female, whispering my name through the intercom. "Run now, or you'll be his next delivery," she hissed. I heard the safety click off of my father's gun just feet away from me. As the warehouse sirens began to wail, I realized the real nightmare was only just beginning. The echoes of the warehouse sirens followed me across the Atlantic like a persistent curse. I arrived at my grandmother's secluded estate in the Polish countryside just as the autumn frost began to bite. Babcia Helena stood in the doorway, her silhouette sharp and unforgiving against the warm light of the foyer. She didn't offer a hug, but instead gripped my chin with cold, bony fingers to inspect my eyes. She whispered that the blood of the father is a burden the son must learn to purify. The house smelled of boiled cabbage, old paper, and something metallic that I couldn't quite name. Dinner was served every evening at exactly 7 o'clock on a table set for 12, despite us being alone. Empty chairs stared back at me, each representing a relative who had supposedly vanished into the history books. Helena insisted that I eat every morsel of the dark bitter soup she prepared specifically for my recovery. Within a week, a dull ache began to throb behind my temples, making the world tilt on its axis. I noticed that Helena never touched the food she served to me, opting instead for dry bread and water. One night I feigned a coughing fit and spat my medicine into a cloth to investigate it later. Under the moonlight, the liquid on the cloth shimmered with the telltale iridescence of foxglove extract. My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized my own grandmother was slowly poisoning my pulse. I began to search her private study while she tended to the garden in the pre-dawn mist. I found a leather-bound ledger containing names of family members dating back to the 19th century. Beside each name was a date of death and a specific chemical compound noted in neat, looping script. She wasn't just recording their deaths, she was documenting the culling of the family tree. A floorboard creaked behind me and I froze as the scent of lavender and rot filled the air. She asked me why I wasn't in bed, resting my weakened spirit. I dropped the ledger onto the desk and demanded to know what happened to my Uncle Stefan. Helena smiled, a thin line that didn't reach her eyes, and said Stefan was too soft for the legacy. She explained that only the strongest must survive to carry the blood, and the rest are merely fertilizer. I realized then that the garden's unnatural beauty was fed by the very family she claimed to protect. I turned to run, but my legs felt heavy and leaden, the poison finally taking hold of my motor skills. She moved toward me with a grace that defied her age, her shadow stretching across the floor like a shroud. I collapsed onto the Persian rug, my vision tunneling into a single point of light. Helena knelt beside me and whispered that the cleansing would be over before the sun reached its zenith. I fought to stay awake, clawing at the carpet as she began to drag my limp body toward the cellar door. The cellar smelled of damp earth and the same metallic tang that permeated the kitchen. I saw rows of glass jars on the cellar shelves, each containing a preserved organ labeled with a family name. This wasn't just a culling, it was a morbid collection of the bloodline she so cherished. My strength returned in a sudden, violent surge of adrenaline fueled by pure survival instinct. I kicked out, catching Helena in the shin and sending her sprawling against the shelves of jars. The sound of breaking glass echoed like gunshots in the confined space as I scrambled for the stairs. Behind me, Helena let out a piercing shriek that sounded more like a wounded animal than a human being. I burst through the front doors and ran into the woods, the freezing air burning my poisoned lungs. Every snap of a twig sounded like her footsteps gaining on me through the undergrowth. I realized I had no idea where I was going, only that I had to put miles between myself and that house. I collapsed by a stream, washing the taste of her bitter soup from my mouth with the icy water. As the sun rose higher, I saw a tattered map tucked into the lining of the coat I'd grabbed from the hallway. The map didn't show the local town, but instead pointed toward the Ozark Mountains in America. A note on the back, written in my father's hand, spoke of a third branch of the family that owed us a debt. If I couldn't find safety here, I would have to track down the syndicate that started this nightmare. But as I turned to leave, I heard the distinct sound of a truck engine idling just beyond the trees, waiting for me. The low rumble of the truck engine vibrated through the damp forest floor beneath my feet. I stood frozen as the headlights flickered to life, cutting two blinding paths through the mist. Instead of a threat, a gravelly voice called out my name from the darkness of the cabin. I walked toward the vehicle, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. An old man with eyes like flint stared back at me, holding a tarnished metal flask. He told me that the story of my family didn't start in the suburbs, but in the hidden hollows of these mountains. He explained how my grandfather had built a kingdom out of moonshine and cold-blooded violence. The wealth that funded my father's logistics empire was actually washed clean from the blood of Ozark rivals. I realized then that every luxury I grew up with was a silent witness to a century of crime. The old man handed me a heavy iron key tied with a piece of rotted twine. He pointed toward a crumbling stone shack barely visible through the thicket of pines. I left the truck behind and began the final climb toward the source of my nightmares. The air around the shack felt colder, as if the ground itself was trying to keep its secrets buried. I inserted the iron key into the lock and it turned with a loud metallic snap. The door groaned open to reveal a room filled with dusty ledger books and cracked glass jars. These ledgers contained the names of everyone my family had bought, sold, or broken. I saw my father's signature on pages dating back 30 years, long before I was born. He wasn't just an inheritor of the business, he was the one who modernized the cruelty. At the bottom of a cedar chest, I found a photograph of my mother looking terrified. She hadn't left us because she didn't love me. She left because she couldn't breathe in this house of cards. I knew what I had to do to end the cycle of silence that had plagued my bloodline. I took the matching fluid from a shelf and doused the papers that documented our sins. The smell of kerosene filled the air, sharp and cleansing against the scent of rot. I dropped the match and the past ignited in a roar of orange and blue flames. I walked out of the shack as the windows began to glow with the heat of the inferno. The old truck was gone, leaving only tire tracks in the mud as a reminder of the witness. I sat on a rock and watched the smoke rise into the early morning sky. The weight that had been on my shoulders for decades finally began to lift. I realized that I couldn't change where I came from, but I could choose where I was going. Tomorrow I would go to the authorities with the digital copies I had made before the fire. The syndicate would fall, and the names in those ledgers would finally find some justice. My father would likely die in a cell, but that was the price of his empire's collapse. I felt my mother's photo in my pocket, a small piece of her finally safe with me. The fire at the shack died down to a smolder, leaving only charred stone and ash. I thought about the grandmother and her poisoned table, and how her obsession had finally reached its end. The bloodline was shattered, but from the shards I could build something honest. Every family has secrets, but they only have power as long as they stay in the dark. I reached my car and turned the key, the engine humming a new kind of song. I drove away from the hollows, leaving the ghosts of the bootleggers behind in the mist. My journey into the shattered bloodlines was over, and for the first time in my life, I was truly free.